Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining me on the new series that we'll be starting today, Get Wisdom. It's our weekly live stream, kind of midweek pick-me-up, getting into the Word together. Before I go too far, just want to let you know that we have been having internet problems here at the church today. We just lost internet a few minutes ago and got it back. So I am recording. If we lose the stream, I will just re-upload it later in the day, and you could watch it then. I don't know about you, but I have been kind of pleasantly surprised about how quickly this fall has gone. I can't believe we're end of September already. I enjoy fall, but I like getting through fall and getting to winter. That's my favorite season. But being the end of September, we do have a few kind of transitions coming up here at ECC. ACGs, the current topics, each go for 2 more Sundays. The political theology one that I am doing and the historicity of the Exodus event that Stephen Lulich is doing. Those each have 2 more weeks. And then starting in early October, I think the date is the 11th for the new series. New series begin in those ACGs. One of them will be on 1 Timothy, and then Jerry Frederick will be leading that. And then I will be doing a study on the book of Micah. I can't say other than the fact that Micah has 7 chapters and I have 7 weeks. It wasn't some super spiritual reason that led me to Micah, but I'm looking forward to diving into that book, which I've never taught through before. So those are in our ACGs, Sunday mornings at 10 o'clock, and those are recorded and live streamed, and you could find those on our website, eccbloomington.org. All right, enough of that kind of housekeeping. We are starting this week with a new series on the Wisdom Psalms. Get Wisdom is what I'm calling the series. But before we dive into actually looking at some of those wisdom psalms and some themes and characteristics, I just want to share with you a common kind of experience that I have. I get in my car, sometimes with my sons or whatever, and turn on the radio. And if I'm the one picking the station, it's probably going to go to a classic rock station. And, you know, I love classic rock. Creedence Clearwater, Steve Miller Band, Rolling Stones, you know, the Eagles. I love classic rock, The Who. But almost every time that I tune it into a classic rock station, a song will come on that I protest. This is not classic rock. You know, maybe it's Guns N' Roses or Genesis or Whitesnake or something like that. I'm like, this isn't classic rock. And I'll get in an argument with my sons about what constitutes classic rock. So what is it? What makes a song classic rock? Is it from a certain group, like the Rolling Stones? Well, what about a song that the Rolling Stones, recorded in 2017? Is that classic rock? Maybe it's from an era. You say the 60s and the 70s. That music is classic rock. Well, what about the Bee Gees? You know, they're in the 70s, but no one calls them classic rock. They're a different genre. They're disco. Maybe it's just a sound. It's hard to describe it. Maybe it's just a sound that is associated with classic rock. I tell you that kind of experience that I have to make a point that genres are often very difficult to define. You know, a musician doesn't sit down and say, okay, I'm going to create a classic rock song. And a psalmist didn't sit down and say, okay, I'm going to write a piece of wisdom literature. I'm going to write a wisdom psalm. The wisdom psalms are actually really hard to identify. There isn't a set list of psalms that are characterized as wisdom psalms. Reading 3 or 4 or 5 different commentaries, they each have different lists on what there's overlap, but there's different lists on what constitutes a wisdom psalm. Matter of fact, one of the commentaries said that the list of wisdom psalms is hotly debated, and another one said that the debate rages. I just want to be a part of those debates, you know. You can just imagine a bunch of stuffy theologians in rooms, Bible scholars, debating whether or not this psalm gets voted off the island of wisdom psalms or not. And within the genre of wisdom psalms, some scholars have delineated different types of wisdom psalms. There's proverb psalms, there's ashri psalms, which are songs about blessedness, and then there's some that are called riddle poems. It can get really confusing, really convoluted, and there isn't a clear set, like I said, of wisdom psalms. So the list that I'm working with is a fairly short list. Psalm 1, Psalm 34, 37, 49, 73. I don't know why I'm reading it. You can read it. It's right there in front of you. That's a fairly typical kind of shorter list of wisdom psalms. Some lists are incredibly extensive. This is just a sample of another list in a commentary, and that commentary treats all of these as wisdom psalms. I think that's beyond the scope of what we can tackle. So I'm going back to that kind of shorter list, and these are the ones that I'll be working with throughout the next, 4 or 5 weeks that we're in this series. Some have tried to define wisdom psalms, and that is, again, problematic. It's difficult to define, just like it's difficult to define what makes a song classic rock. One person said wisdom psalms are those psalms that show an affinity to wisdom literature. Job, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs are deemed wisdom literature. So wisdom psalms are psalms that kind of look like the wisdom literature. I don't know that that's particularly helpful, because what makes those other books wisdom literature? What characteristics do they have? Another commentator said the wisdom tradition upholds the virtues of godliness, the rewards of God, the contrasting ways of the righteous and the wicked, and the respective ends of both groups. I think that's a little bit more helpful. It gives us a little bit more to work with, some characteristics of wisdom literature and then of wisdom psalms. I think one helpful suggestion is that it isn't just one particular thing that characterizes something as a wisdom psalm, but a combination of things. For example, wisdom psalms tend to have a common vocabulary or a common form. For example, most wisdom psalms will say something like, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the path of the wicked," or fill in the blank there. It has that formula, "Blessed is." Now, not every wisdom psalm has that, but many do. There's a common vocabulary of the wise or the foolish, and kind of a contrasting of those. A lot of them will refer to the reader as, "My son, walk in these ways," or "cherish this teaching." There's a common kind of vocabulary and form to the wisdom psalms that helps us identify them. There's also a didactic or an instructional nature to the wisdom psalms. They're meant for instruction, which is different than, say, Genesis. Genesis is written to record history for us so that we know what God did in history, in the calling of Abraham and, the patriarchs. And obviously we can use that for instruction, but the form is different and the purpose is different. Or many of the other psalms aren't written necessarily to instruct us, but to lead us in worship and to praise and to thanksgiving. So the wisdom psalms stand out because of their didactic nature, which means they're going to include a lot of admonitions and exhortations. For example, "My son, gain wisdom," or "My son, watch your step," things like that. So exhortations, admonitions. They also often contain, because they're didactic, the author wants them to be memorable. They contain, brief, memorable statements. Kind of like, "Life is like a box of chocolates. Mama told me." Like that, but obviously different. So, Proverbs, I think it's 4:23, "Guard your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the well springs of life." The short, memorable proverb And a lot of the wisdom psalms contain those kind of short, memorable proverbs as well. So you got, form and vocabulary, the didactic nature, and then third, and for me, most important, are the themes that the wisdom psalms kind of tackle. There's a common set of themes in most, if not all, of the wisdom psalms that qualify them to be called wisdom psalms. And those themes are what we're going to be focusing on. I'm going to try and keep these, this series and these live streams a little bit shorter than the last series, not in terms of number of weeks, but the length of the discussions. And each discussion is going to be centered around one of the themes of wisdom literature. And here for the next few minutes, I'll just kind of outline what some of those themes are. The first kind of major theme that you see in the wisdom literature is a comparison and a contrasting. Sometimes it's between the wicked and the righteous. Sometimes it's between the foolish and the wise, or the obedient and the rebellious. But there's this contrasting between the two. An example of that kind of contrasting, you could actually look at one of Jesus' parables. The parable of the wise man who built his house on the rock, and the foolish man who built his house on the sand. That kind of comparison and contrasting is something that is very common in the wisdom literature. Kind of makes it stand out as wisdom literature. The pastor and author James Montgomery Boyce referred to this as the doctrine of the two ways. The psalmist is highlighting, comparing, contrasting these two different ways of life, wickedness and righteousness, and in a sense urging us to choose one. So that's the first major theme, and we'll talk about that in 1 week. Another one is the respective end of both of those groups. So you get these two groups contrasted, and one of the ways that they're contrasted is kind of their respected ends. The righteous, the obedient, the wise are blessed. They have a life that is flourishing. If I'm completely honest, this is one of the ways that I kind of struggle with the wisdom literature, because it holds out, a blessed life, a life of flourishing for the righteous, and an unhappy, unblessed, tragic kind of life for the wicked. And I struggle with that because on a very simplistic reading, they don't always appear to be true, right? Because I know quite a few wicked people who tend, or at least on the surface, look very happy. So the wisdom literature encourages us or requires us to go deeper than the surface. On the surface, the wicked might look happy, but dig deeper and look longer. Not just the immediate experience of life, but the wisdom writers encourage us to look beyond the immediate experience into the eternal. Part of this is that the wisdom writers do acknowledge and kind of hold up the doctrine of retribution as something that should happen. We should get our just deserts. The righteous should receive blessing. The wicked should receive judgment. They hold that up as something that is should happen. It's an ought. It's kind of the cosmic scales should balance, and as something that does happen and will happen. It does happen in the here and the now, and it will happen in the future in eternity. So that kind of idea of the respective ends of the wicked and the righteous is a major theme in the wisdom literature. Third major theme is the different paths that the righteous and the wicked take. And I mean, it would be easy to say, well, the wicked take a wicked path and the righteous take a righteous path. But the wisdom psalms kind of flesh that out a little bit more. The wicked take the path of, arrogance, of disregard for advice or wisdom, disregard for God and his law, while the righteous accept correction. They're humble, they're steadfast, they're not easily swayed, and primarily they're characterized by a fear of the Lord. So not only do the righteous end up in different places than the wicked, they take different paths. And that's a major theme that we will talk about in this study of the wisdom literature. Kind of a fourth major theme is this, what I will call creational theology in wisdom literature. Most of the wisdom literature is not a record of "thus saith the Lord" kind of stuff. It's not God speaking from on high, Mount Sinai, and the author writing down God's words. It's more observational. For example, Proverbs 32 encourages the reader to look at the ant and see how diligently they work, or to look at the locusts and see how well they're organized, to look at the rabbit and learn from its patterns of life, to look at the spider and see it's lowly and it's in the pauper's house, but it's also in the king's palace. Observing nature and learning from it is a major theme of wisdom literature. So wisdom literature and wisdom in general has a lot of overlap with what is often referred to as kind of natural theology, natural law. In the wisdom psalms, you don't see as much of the looking at nature, the natural world, and observing it and learning lessons from spiders and ants and birds. But you do see the author looking at the world around them, making observations and saying, based on what I see, the righteous prosper and the wicked don't. Or based on what I see, the wicked, though they might be rich, they don't get to take it with them. They leave it all behind. So they're observing life, observing the order of God's world, and making conclusions based on that. They're sharing their own personal experiences and what that looks like. So there's this kind of creational theology rather than revealed theology. Now, I don't mean that this wasn't inspired. That's not at all what I mean. But if you look at wisdom literature in the Bible, there's a tremendous amount of overlap between wisdom literature and other cultures. That's because so much of it is based on, when I'm talking about the Bible, God-inspired observation of his world. Now, in the Psalms, that is heightened, I think, slightly. And it's not just what you observe in the world, but all of that is put in the context of God's covenant with his people. So we'll talk about that. I spent a lot of time explaining that. We'll talk about that one week. And then we'll spend another week talking about the fear of the Lord. Because, Solomon says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So we need to understand what that means and dive into what the fear of the Lord looks like. I thought we could kind of end this this afternoon, looking at Psalm 1. The very beginning of the Psalter starts with a wisdom psalm. And Psalm 1 has a lot of these themes that I was mentioning. Here's my kind of color-coded printout of Psalm 1 that I've highlighted. So I'll read it. I don't have it on the screen. Psalm 1 says, "Blessed is the one who does not walk in the steps of the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on this law day and night. That person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers. Not so the wicked. They are like chaff that the wind blows away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked leads to destruction." So as you can see, Psalm 1, one of these wisdom psalms, has that comparison and contrast, the righteous and the wicked. The Lord watches over the way of the righteous. The way of the wicked leads to destruction. It talks about their kind of respective ends, the righteous person is like a tree planted by the stream of water, versus the wicked person who is like chaff. This psalm does describe the path of the righteous person. They don't walk in the steps of the wicked. They're not found in the company of the mockers. Instead, they delight in the Lord. They meditate on his law. It doesn't really describe in this passage what the wicked do, their path, but it's contrasted with the righteous. You don't necessarily see kind of creational theology coming through here, but this is observational, right? Based on what I see in my life, the wicked don't prosper. Their end leads to destruction. So you see kind of all of these themes that we'll talk about. And I'll be pulling from all of the different Psalms each week as we talk about these themes. I hope that the series is kind of encouraging to us, and specifically that it encourages us to pursue wisdom and to call to others to kind of join us in this pursuit. One of the things that I think the modern church is maybe deficient in is passing on accumulated wisdom from one generation to the next. Generational ministries are needed and they're important, but when that leads to a generational disconnect, it's hard for the older generations to pass on these kind of shared life experiences and life observations and this accumulated wisdom through generations to the next generation. So I do hope that we can, individually and kind of corporately, hear these calls to wisdom and learn from them, and be diligent about passing on the wisdom of God to the next generation. That's all I had for this morning. I'm at 22 minutes. I am kind of targeting 20 minutes, so I went a little bit long. But encourage you to come back next week, and next week we will be talking about one of those kind of major themes in the wisdom literature. If you have questions or comments, you can feel free. It looks like the chat kind of got disconnected, a little discombobulated when the internet crashed. But you can leave comments in the comments section, and I'll check those. You can also email me directly if you have questions or comments. Thank you again for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next week.